Welcome to the latest episode of Powering Production, the podcast where we unpack the biggest energy challenges facing UK manufacturers and how to overcome them. Like and subscribe to stay updated with the latest episodes.
Why does SECR matter for manufacturers and suppliers across the value chain?
I think there's a couple of reasons. Firstly, and probably the most obvious reason, is that for companies that fall in SECR scope, it's a legal requirement, which seems like a pretty good reason to me. And those companies that fall in scope are defined as large companies. Somewhat confusingly, it's different to the ESOS definition of a large company. We'll go into that in a bit more detail, but I think certainly the primary reason is that compliance aspect, because companies that fall in scope have to report out on SECR in their annual statutory accounts that get submitted to Companies House. And for some companies, that's as far as they take it. But I think probably the smarter companies and use that information not just in use that SECR data, not just in their statutory accounts, as part of their presentation, their brand management, and their presentation of themselves to the market, to help demonstrate what they're doing to their customer base in terms of trying to tackle their emissions.
So what are the most common frustrations you see from businesses trying to prepare these reports?
The biggest frustration is data gathering. We talked previously about the frustrations for data gathering for ESOS, and the frustrations for data gathering for SECR are exactly the same. There's also an element that, because the SECR reporting forms part of the financial reporting, the statutory accounts that go to the Companies House, I've seen so frequently is that SECR reporting piece gets left to the last minute in terms of putting together the stat accounts, and then it becoming a panic to get it pulled together in time for submission of the stat accounts.
So where do they most often make a mistake in their submissions?
I think companies firstly don't understand whether SECR applies to them or not. The thresholds for SECR are employee numbers, and the threshold is the employee count of 250 people, a turnover of £36 million per year, and a balance sheet, that's a gross balance sheet of 18 million. So those financial thresholds are lower than the ESOS thresholds, but the way that the thresholds apply is also different. So for SECR, if you exceed two of those three thresholds, or three of those three thresholds, two out of three or more, then you're in scope. I think the second thing is the reporting requirements depend on what kind of company you are, whether you're a quoted company or not. And if you're a quoted company, you have to report on your global emissions. Whereas if you're an unquoted large company that exceeds the thresholds, you only have to worry about your UK emissions. What I've seen in a number of cases is the numbers get pulled together, the reports get fired in, and companies have basically used a different approach from one year to the next.
Right.
One of the things you have to do in your SECR submission in your stat accounts is present a comparison of this year's numbers with last year's numbers. But what you frequently see is quite a large swing from one year to the next, and there might be an increase in emissions or a decrease in emissions, and that's got really nothing to do with what's actually happened in the business and everything to do with a different approach in determining the emissions. I think the solution to that is, one way to address that is, just as with your statutory accounts, you have to make a submission to Companies House every year. But every company I've ever been involved with goes through a management accounting process that is typically monthly. So the board, the exec will sit down and look at the numbers at least on a monthly basis. And the thing to do, I think, with your energy use and your emissions is to include those as part of your monthly reporting process. The fact you're doing it regularly will lead you into a consistent approach to the data collection. It will help you identify where may have gaps in your data collection. And it just takes away that element of panic.
Multi-site manufacturers often say that SECR is a nightmare. So what makes it so tricky? And how would you suggest that they can manage that better?
What you need to do is gather that data monthly. I do think it's important at each location to have someone whose job it is to gather this data. So anything you can do to move towards a system that collects that data automatically. We're moving towards mandatory half-hour settlement. So for the electricity meters, people will start getting smart meters or AMRs that means that data can be recorded, and getting a system in place that automatically gathers that data, so you don't have people getting a bill, picking up typing that into a spreadsheet. I think that really is the main thing, because for most organisations, the majority of the emissions that they have to report under SECR are going to come from one of three main sources. One of those is electricity use, second of those is gas use, and the third of those is transport. So 2 out of 3 of those on the electricity and the gas, whatever people's consumption is metered.
Yeah, so how should manufacturers approach energy use beyond electricity and gas then?
So under SECR, you're required to report on your Scope 1 emissions, your Scope 2 emissions. So Scope 1 is gas, okay, for most people. Scope 2 is imported energy, electricity, typically. Transport is the third area where you're looking at if you've got company vehicles, whether that's cars, HGVs, vans, stuff like that. You need to report on the emissions from those. And SECR is quite explicit that you also have to include emissions from grey fleet. So when I say grey fleet, what I mean is vehicles that are owned by your employees but are used on company business, and then they're reimbursed either for fuel or for the use of the car. And something I should have said earlier actually for SECR is, what you have to report in SECR is your energy use and your emissions. Okay? The government publishes a set of greenhouse gas conversion factors, which is a spreadsheet of almost the same size as the universe. And that's just the simplified set. That basically tells you if you've used this many kilowatt hours of electricity, you multiply by this number in the greenhouse gas conversion factor set, and that tells you your emissions for that particular item. So, coming back to transport, in order to determine your emissions from employees who've been driving around in their own cars on company business, what you really need to know is how many litres of fuel have they used when they've been doing that. Where those emissions from driving around in cars like that is a very significant proportion of your energy use and your emissions, that grey fleet becomes a real problem. For most companies who've got their own fleet, who own a fleet of vehicles, whether it's HGVs or company cars that you use frequently on business, a lot of those have got fuel card systems, so they know how much fuel they've bought in the course of a year for those vehicles.
So we've already covered kind of the importance of record keeping and evidence in SECR reporting.
Yeah.
What do businesses, you've kind of touched on some of it, but what other things do businesses often overlook in there?
What I can almost guarantee they'll exclude is electricity transmission. People always leave that out. People frequently leave out fugitive emissions from refrigerants. The people start verging into reporting on Scope 3 for SECR, which is not a statutory requirement. I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad thing, but I think certainly for your stat accounts, you probably need to stick to exactly what is required in terms of the legislation for reporting. Those are the areas we see missing. I think the other things are seen on a number of occasions. So this the settler conversion factors that I mentioned earlier, they're updated on an annual basis. So every year, the UK government issues a revised set of greenhouse gas conversion factors, and each year you should you really should use the latest set of greenhouse gas conversion factors to apply to your energy use. And that does start becoming material. So the 2025 set of conversion factors was assumed, I think it was about in June. And last year there was a 15% drop in the amount of carbon emitted from each kilowatt hour of electricity generated in the UK. And that's primarily because the mix of generation is different. So there's less carbon being emitted for each kilowatt hour. Conversely, between 2022 and 2023, there was about a 10% increase in the amount of carbon being emitted per kilowatt hour because of the change in the mix. What can happen, you could use exactly the same amount of energy from one year to the next, but you could see a 10 or 15% change in your carbon emissions without doing anything different.
How would you advise manufacturers to stay on top of those changes?
This brings into another area of confusion with SECR, because I think a lot of people are going out there and acquiring green energy. In terms of SECR reporting, the way it's set up at the moment, the requirement of the legislation is for your carbon emission calculation, you use the UK average. The legislation does allow for a thing called dual reporting, and I'd recommend anyone who's got, signed up to a renewable deal or is getting 100% renewable gas or electricity or REGOs associated with a gas supply. You can go down the route of dual reporting whereby you say, if we apply the UK average for the greenhouse gas conversion factors, these are our carbon emissions. However, we actually buy 100% of our electricity is renewable, and therefore, as it actually applies to us, our carbon emissions are this much lower. But what I see in a number of cases is essentially people reporting the wrong number. Understandably, what they tend to do is just go straight to the I'm using 100% renewable energy or renewable electricity, therefore my SECR report should be 0. That's not the case.
What would you say is the biggest misconception about SECR reporting across manufacturers?
Can I have 2 of those? can have two misconceptions.
Yes.
I think the first is, if I'm in ESOS, I'm in SECR. Not necessarily the case. Okay? So always worth taking a look. What I would say on that subject is the data set for ESOS and the data set for SECR is almost exactly the same. So if you are in scope for both ESOS and SECR, do them as part of the same exercise. That wherever you can, align with your financial year. But if you're in scope for ESOS, it doesn't necessarily mean you're in scope for SECR, and vice versa.
How would they go about checking?
Sorry?
How would they go about checking that?
If you search online for SECR thresholds and ESOS thresholds, understand those and just see if they apply to you or not. The other area of confusion is probably around the which bits of my organisations does this apply to? And there is that, there's that possibility of confusion between quoted and unquoted companies, because the extent on which you have to report differs there. If you're a manufacturing company and you exceed the thresholds, you're in. Yeah. Where it starts becoming the edges become more blurred is whether if you've got any joint ventures or if you own a facility in conjunction with another organisation. That's where it starts becoming blurry.
And what would a manufacturer do in that situation? How would they approach it?
Well, again, I think that's go back to the guidelines, and there are quite specific guidelines as to what constitutes operational control, and it typically is, if you own more than 50%, or even if you own less than 50%, do you have operational control of it, despite the fact someone else might have a greater ownership than you?
Oh. So what things would need to go in the statutory report to cover SECR reporting compliantly?
Okay, so the legislation is quite prescriptive about what needs to go in, and it differs for quoted companies, so companies that are quoted on FTSE or AIM listed, and unquoted. But the vast majority of companies in the UK to whom SECR applies are going to be unquoted. And what they have to report on is their UK energy use. And I think it's important to point, you've got to state energy use as well as emissions. So your UK energy use for scopes 1 and 2. You've got to state your emissions, your greenhouse gas emissions, which are calculated using the government spreadsheet, so make sure you're using the right year. Another thing that's required is at least one intensity ratio. So it might be kilograms of CO2 or tons of CO2 per £1 million of turnover, or it might be tons of CO2 per ton of ton of product. But it will be, we produce so many kilograms of CO2 or tons of CO2 per whatever is a useful measure in your company. And the purpose of that is so that if very simply, is if your volume goes up, you would expect your total emissions to go up.
Uh-huh.
The regulations require you to report at least one intensity ratio. I'd recommend you come up with 2 or 3, which might be per employee, per £1 million of turnover, and per ton of product produced, for instance. Reason for having more than one, I know it's a bit more work, but there's a chance that, depending on what happens, if you just pick one and it starts waving around in the wind from year to year, it can become very confusing. So having 2 or 3 just to allow you to kind of interpolate. I mean, not interpolate, but it just gives you a range of different views is helpful, which it does take much to calculate. One of the other things you have to do is compare this year's figures with last year's figures. For each year after your first year, you have to compare this year with the previous year. Again, and particularly if it's showing a good trend, there's no reason why you shouldn't report last year, the year before, and the year before if you're on a downward trajectory in your emissions. You also have to state what your what energy efficiency actions you'll put in place. I think, again, from memory, you only have to report 1. But again,
Is the most you want?
I would say, if you only do 1, it does look like you're just ticking the box and moving on. And coming back to the earlier question about how do you turn this into a benefit? The way to turn this into a benefit is start looking at how do I reduce my emissions? I reduce my emissions by reducing my energy use, and if I reduce my energy use, I save money. So it's worth. I think it's always worth having a number of possible actions in there. And the final thing that you're required to do is state your methodology, which always differs from company to company, but it basically comes down to we gather the data from everywhere and we use the government's greenhouse gas conversion factors and so on. So those are the things you've got to put in.
How can manufacturers specifically make SECR data work harder for them rather than just treating it as a compliance operation?
Okay, so I think the big thing for me is to use SECR as a departure point for defining your carbon reduction plan. Fundamentally, what SECR is about is establishing and monitoring what your carbon emissions are from your operation. What we're seeing in just about every aspect of business that we engage with at the moment is stronger and stronger focus coming on organisations' carbon emissions and their plans for moving to net zero from their supply chain, from their customers. Most large public-facing bodies, whether that's commercial, whether it's whether it's Tesco, whether it's B&Q, Screwfix, most of them are starting to ask their suppliers, what are you doing about reducing your carbon emissions?
So if a manufacturer realises that they are behind or unprepared right now, in terms of their SECR reporting, what would you say is the first steps that they should take tomorrow?
If you've not done it before and you're thinking your scope and you establish that you are in scope for SECR, you've got to go through the steps of establishing what your organisational boundary is. So which bits of the organisation are in, which are out. Then the next thing to do is gather data on energy use. And I would say concentrate on the big bits. For most manufacturers, that is going to be your electricity use, your gas use, and if you've got if transportation is part of your business as well, get a handle on that. And I wouldn't sweat the small stuff. I think if you get 90-95% of your emissions in there in the first year, you're doing well. You really don't want to underestimate your first year's emissions. to some extent, err on the side of err upwards in terms of your emissions assessment. Because what people are going to be looking at is what's your journey in terms of emissions. And if you start off saying we're hardly emitting anything, it doesn't make it very difficult to show any degree of improvement. But I would say sooner you start, the less painful it's going to be later.
Are there any other pieces, you have kind of a single piece of advice that we may not have covered today for manufacturers so that they can stay ahead on SECR reporting?
Energy use and carbon emissions happen as a result of your operations. They don't happen as a result of your HR department or your finance department or your marketing department or wherever. So for you to get a handle on it and for you to manage it, I recommend that people with operational responsibility are given responsibility for at least reporting on the energy use. So it needs someone operational who can make a difference, and you need someone operational to be worrying about it. It might all get collated by the finance department at the end of the day, but that's where it needs to be. That's where it needs to sit in terms of responsibility within the organisation.